This is Gemara and Beitzah Daf Yud Gimel. All the learning for this month, the month of Tishrei, the month of all the Yom Tovim, has been generously sponsored. The Schos Refuah Shleima for Shleima Ben Yita, Meretz Hashem. The learning of the entire Chabura should be a tremendous Schos for his Refuah Shleima, as well as all the other Chedim. Shol Yosef Ben Hani Afraid of Men Vevega Chaim Mitzvah Shamsim Reitzah Zar Bas Kanan Dili Basim Es Chayisay Yourself and Mendel Eliyad Zebrazim Shavlei Shom Azami V'Shavik Shirchan Shmol Ventil Din Mechan Rizim Chaim Mesina Adin Edom Echin Mendes Vim Vegor Nechal Ezunas Elhuva Rivka Bas Hashem Natalsim Echol Esther V'Soy Shar Choli Yisrael as well as Cheshach Yisrael Chaim and Devair and Shir Miriam Bas Rezel Gittel. We're holding at the bottom of Yud Beis and Mid Beis. We little ran through the last Gemara, so I like to rewind a bit and go up 8 lines from the bottom and learn this last story again. You can actually see if I highlighted the key points, but we're just going to read the whole story through a little bit faster. Says the Gemara, Ashbazinchei. So this, the host, the innkeeper had, what do you have? Bundles of chardla, of mustard stalk. And Amrlei said to him, I'm allowed to crumble the pod. It's a mustard seed inside some sort of pod. I'm allowed to crumble the pod in order to get the seeds out on Yontif, basically a fundamental shayla. We know there's a melacha of dash, of threshing, of getting rid of the outside, getting out the inside, threshing wheat, threshing grains, etc. Is that applicable on Yontif? Can I do it to the mustard? Amar Lei, so he responded, Lo Aviyad, he didn't have an answer. So that was the first Rava Barachan and didn't know what to say. I don't know if you're allowed to do this. Asli Kamei to Rava. So they came in front of Rava, and Amar Lei, Rava responded, I'll tell you what the halacha is. Moilelin Malilois. You're allowed to be moilel melilois. You're allowed to rub melilois of ears of grain. Important word, as we're going to see a lot about that today. As well as, says Rava, you're allowed to be mefarchen kitnius. You're allowed to crumble legumes, these mustard and these type of items. You're allowed to crumble the pods to get to the inside seeds in Yontif. So Rava says there's no problem. Abai asks 1 second. It says in our Beitzah, melilos me erev Shabbos l'machar on Yontif. And this Beitzah we're going to deal a bit with more in towards a little bit more of today's daf. So we'll come back to exactly what's going on over here. But let's first read it fast to get the question. It says you're allowed to rub these pods in Erev Shabbos, and the next day you could blow away the husks. And you can eat it. You can't separate it in a specialized utensil, a funnel or a large plate, which is actually a medium level utensil for bayr. Similarly, let her crumble the pods in Erev Yantiv, the next day on Yantiv, let it blow from hand to hand, you even allowed to use specialized utensils. You can't use the highest level, you can't use a board, a sieve, the highest level utensils of bayr. But what do we see clearly in this Beitzah? Clearly it says in this Beitzah that these legumes, these pods, when are you allowed to crumble them? On Erev Yontif. However, on Yontif itself, you're not allowed to. Answers the Gemara, and that was Abayi's question on Rava. Answers the Gemara, Afilu Tema B'Yontif. I did Tani Reisha B'Erev Shabbos, Tani Seifanam B'Erev Yontif. Classic Teretz. Just because the first part of the Beitzah said Erev Shabbos, second part of the Beitzah said Erev Yontif, but really, on Yontif, there's no problem. And now, says the Gemara, based on this Beitzah, we can ask a question back on what we said a bit ago yesterday. Imkain, if that what you're saying is true, then we have a problem. What's the problem? Motzinu truma shezakai baramasan. We found the case that you could have truma and you're allowed to separate the truma on Yontif. Utanan, but yet, what did our Mishnah teach us yesterday? Lo yimamarti b'truma she'inei zakai baramasan v'chulu. Beisil said to Beishamai, truma you're not allowed to do on Yontif. So you can't compare truma. Yesterday was discussion was comparing truma to challah and to other matanas kuna. But what do we see? Says the Gemara. We see that you could separate truma. The whole question was that you can't separate truma, so it's not comparable. But we see clearly in this Beitzah that you're allowed to separate truma on Yontif. Answers the Gemara, Loi Kasha. Really, what's halacha? Really, you're allowed to rub the ears of grain? Really, you're allowed to get rid of the pots? However, moving over to today's daf of Yigimel and Aleph, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. There's 2 opinions. When do we say that you're allowed to separate the Truma and Yontif? That's Rabbi. When did our Mishnah say you're not allowed to separate the Truma and Yontif? That's Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. Titania, as we learned in our Beitzah, if you bring in the ears of grain in order to make a dough with them, you bring in stalks, upaiter. You're allowed to eat from them in a temporary manner. Allah, we've seen many times that the only time they have an obligation of a chiyav of meiser is only when the grains, when the item is finished, when you pile it up, when you make a smooth out pile, which we're going to see more about today. But you're always allowed to eat in a temporary manner. All right. So says the Beitzah, you brought it in to make dough with it. What's the halacha? You're allowed to eat in a temporary manner, and there's no truma on that. Let's say, why did you bring in the grain? You didn't bring it in to make a dough. You brought in the grains to roll it, to get rid of the outside pod, the outside shell, and to get the seeds from the inside. Then what's the halacha? Or do you then have to think of truma? Says the Gemara, Rabbi Machayev, you have to think of truma, Rabbi Yehuda Paiter. So the answer is the Gemara. We have a contradiction between our Mishnah that seemed to say there's no problem thinking of Meiser and truma. We have this Mishnah that seemed to say that there is. Says the Gemara, one's Rabbi and one is Rab Yosi Rabbi Yehuda. When do we say that you have to take off Trumas and Meisers? That's going to be Rabbi Yisrael, Rabbi Yehuda, even if you only brought it in to roll off the outside. And of course, the crux of the discussion is what is considered a completion process. Do we say that when I bring in this item in order to eat it in this manner of taking out these inside shells by getting rid of the pod, that's called the normal manner, and therefore Yochayev a Meiser says, Truma says Rabbi Yisrael, Rabbi Yehuda says no. Answers the Gemara 1 second, 4 lines from the top. There is also a case that you potentially could have a chiyav truma on yantif, and therefore it's back to our question. What was our question? That the Mishnah said that there's no obligation to separate truma on yantif, and we saw in the Mishnah that there is. We answered up the contradiction. Says the Gemara, but even according to Rabbi Yehuda, there still is an obligation. In what case? You bring in the ears of grain, you bring in these stalks to make with it dough, but then you change your mind. And you say, nah, I'm not going to make dough. Who has the time? Forget it. I'll just roll off the pot and eat the inside. In that case, B'Yantif, the Tavla B'Yaymi became Tavel, became completed on the day of Yantif. And everyone's going to give a Chiyav Truma. So even according to Rabbi Yehuda, we have a case that's going to be a Chiyav Truma. Ella answers the Gemara, my Truma, Roiv Truma. What did the Mishnah say? That there's no separation of Truma and Yantif is the majority of the cases, but you will be able to find unique specific cases when did the Mishnah say that there's no obligation? You do not separate Truma and Yantif is the majority of cases, but you will be able to find unique cases that you do. Says the Gemara, Amar Abaye. Let's go to the Beitzah we mentioned a few moments before on the bottom of the base. Let's dissect it a bit deeper. 8 lines from the top. First one, the line is Amar. Amar Abaye machloikis b'shibal and avlkinis devei akola suraisa tivla. Says Abaye, we just said a machloikis Rabbi and Rabbi Yehuda. When you bring in these stalks of grain, I know we're not farmers, so many of us have a difficulty with these applications, but very simply, you bring in ears of grain, stalks of grain, which has its outside husk, and you get rid of the outside and you get the inside. And you could do that for one of 2 reasons. Either you could do that to crush it up and make flour to make dough, or you could do it to eat the inside seeds. Says the Gemara, says Abaye, the debate between Rabbi and Rabbi Yehuda is only bekitnius, is only when there's the ears of grain, avul bekitnius, when you have a case of legumes, like our case of beans, then divrei hakol suraisa tivla, that we make them into a bundle, that creates obligation of truma, for the simple reason that is what they're used for. Legumes are used to eat the pods. So once you make a bundle, even though you don't have a proper pile and smoothed out, but that's called the final stage at some level, if everyone will agree, you have to think of truma. And on that says Gemara, I'll bring you right to that. Someone has bundles, that's the crucial word, but it happens to be of tilson of Fenu Greek, of Tavel or you let it crush it, and think how much seed is inside this Fenu Greek. And then you can separate from the other seeds, you cannot separate from the stalks. So what do we see very clearly? We see that there's a case that there's going to be an obligation of truma even when they're in the bundles. Just like Abaye just answered, that once it's going to be a suraisa, once it's in the bundle, everyone agrees it's how you think of truma. As we see clearly over here, that once you're in the bundle, there's an obligation to think of truma. Says the Gemara, my love. So what do we see? That Rabbi Yehudi, that that this Beitzah is going with Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore on one hand we says a bundle, yes, has an obligation to take of truma. On the other hand, there's a bundle that does not have an obligation to take of truma. So it must be there's 2 different items. When it comes to legumes, then there's an obligation to take of truma, like we just answered, because that's the normal way of eating it. When it comes to grains, then it's not. That's exactly what Abaye said. That on grains there's no obligation, but on legumes this is the normal process to bundle them up, so will be this obligation. The Amar, my love, Rav Yisrael Rav Yehudi says Gemara Rav Yusuf, the Amar Asam loy tavla acha tavla. And that's how we answered. One is called a legume, and one is called a ear of grain. The legumes have an obligation in the bundles. Excuse me, the ear of grains do not. Answers the Gemara, loy. Rabbi, really, we're going with the opinion of Rabbi. Rabbi says the Gemara, Ma'ari Tilson, I feel Shibalin Nahami. So why do the Brises speak out a case of Tilson, a case of fenugreek, a case of a legume that it's normal to eat the inside? Why did it not say a case of Shibalin of regular grains? Because according to Rabbi, even regular grains, and you want to rub them to eat the inside, there's obligation of Truma, Elamai, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Lashmina, Charmine Kitnies, Vakolshkein Tilson. He could have said it's a case of all other grains, all other legumes, excuse me, and certainly Tilson. Ella Tilson is Richle. So why did the Beitzah hone in on this unique case of fenugreek? What's special about Tilson? Fenugreek is a unique creation that the time of the eights of the tree of the stalk is the same taste as the pre as the fruit. So you would think so you also have to separate the stalk. And that is the chiddush of Rav Yehuda, that you do not have to separate the stalk. And that is how the Beitzah concludes this part of the Gemara, explaining the opinion of Abaye, as Abaye explained the opinion of Rabbi and Rav Yisrael Yehuda. Again, that the debate was specifically on the shibalin of the ears of grain. But everyone's going to agree that legumes, once they're in the bundle, they have an obligation to take of truma, because that is the normal process. Igad Amri, and as always, Igad Amri is the second way of learning the exact same thing we said a moment ago. It's going to be the exact same thing, 180 degrees the opposite. Amar Abaye, says the Gemara, Machlekes b'shibalin. What's the machlekes Rabbi Yehuda is by shibalin and by ears of grain? Avol kidney is by legumes. So a moment ago, what did we say? Everyone holds that they are tavla. You have to think of truma. According to this lashon, by the legumes, they're akol asurai salai tavla. You do not have to think of truma. Everyone agrees that they do not have an obligation. Now says the Gemara, we have a question. Meisvei asked the Gemara, so who has bundles of fenugreek is allowed to think and estimate how much there is, how many seeds are in the inside of Ma'afar Shala Zera, and separate on the seed, and not on the stalks. My love, what is this case of this fenugreek that you're able to guesstimate and separate how much seed that you think there is? Tevel Tavel Shal Truma. Says the Gemara, seemingly, what would the case be? A case of Tevel of Truma. And what do we see? We see clearly that fenugreek, which is a legume, yet even though it's in a bundle, we see it has an obligation of meiser. And you just told me, Kediyamri, according to this lashon, what did you just tell me? That everyone agrees that it's not tevel in the bundle. Answers the Gemara, law, it's not what it's referring to. Tavel tavel shall chumas meiser. It's talking about the tavel of chumas meiser, unique creation, which will harken us back to the Gemara Eruvin, Gemara Shabbos days, Uchderav Avua, the famous statement of Rav Avua, Rav Shimon ben Lakish. And let's see what this is. The Amar Rav Avua, Rav Shimon ben Lakish. Meiser rishon shekdimu b'shibal. If you gave a meiser rishon early, while it's still in the ears of grain, usually what do? You take all your grains, you pile it up, you make a smooth pile. You give chuma gedayla, you give 10%, you give 2% to the kain. So let's say of your 100 grains, you give 2 grains to the 2 bundles, 2 grains to the kain. You have 98 left. Then you give chumas mais, you give 10% to the Levi. Of the 98, you give 9.8. And then you give, and the Levi is going to give to the Kain. What happens is the Levi jumps the gun, that instead of first giving the Kain his 2%, the Levi grabs his 10% first, before the obligation came to give it to the Kain. Why? Because it's still in the ears of grain, it's not yet in the pile that's smooth. The obligation to give to the Kain is only when it's in a complete process. So what if the Levi comes early and takes his 10% before the Kain took his Truma Gedayla? What's going to happen? Then instead of the Levi getting 9.8 and the Kain getting 2, what's going to happen is that the Levi is going to get 10, and the Kohen is going to subsequently take 10% off of 90, therefore only get 9. And therefore, 2% off 90, only get 1.8. So the difference is going to be, to make a long story short, that by the Levi grabbing his 10% before the Kohen's 2%, the Levi gets an extra fifth. So says the Gemara, what is the halacha in that case? Says Rav Hu in the name of Reish Lakish, Ma'aser Rishon Shektibu B'Shibah, that you went early and you took them well, they're still in the ears of grains, Shemai Tavlu Chumas Ma'aser. Its name is Tevel with regard to Chumas Meiser. And therefore, you're going to continue, and that's the case of the Beitzah. We'll see more about this in 1 second. Says the Gemara, You just told me that we're talking about Tevel. Excuse me. You just told me you're talking about Tevel of Chumas Meiser. Koitish Lamali. So what's the case? In the Beitzah, it said you have to take the fenugreek, you got to grind it up, remove the seeds, and then take off Chumas Meiser. What's the reason? What should happen? The Levi should tell the Kohen, just like I got it, I'll give it to you. Why do I, the Levi, have to go and grind it and then give the Kohen? I'll give you the Kohen the same way I got it in the ears of grain. My Rabbi, you know why? Knasa, we knas the Levi. You Levi jumped the gun. You should not have taken your 10% before the Kohen. And even though what you got was not fully processed grain, you do not get it after it was fine flour. You have to go and grind it up and then give it to the Kohen. You know why? A knas for you jumping the gun. Tananami Achi says, Gemara, we have a right to this point. Ben Levi should not that took the ears of grain as his meiser, Oisen Asan Gairin. He has to create a granary, anavim, grapes, Oisen Asan Yain, he create wine. Zaytim olives, Oisen Shem. I mean, the Levi has to go and complete the process before the Kohen gets. Just like Chuma Gdolin is not taken as we move over to Gimel and base. Just like the Chuma Gdolin is only taken from the Gairin when it's fully completed. From the wine press, and it tells and therefore that is the reason why the Levi gets kanas, gets fined. For what reason? Because you took early. You're not supposed to take before the Kohen. You jumped the gun. We nail you and we make you finish the process before the Kohen goes and gets his amount. Now, one of the dinim that we said in Amud Aleph was mechashiv. They're allowed to guesstimate. It's a little bit difficult, this Gemara, because it jumps back and forth. Just hold this idea that we just said of Rav of the Levi jumping early before the Kohen. We're going to get back to there in 2 minutes, but before we get back to there, we go to a different din that we said in Amud Aleph. What do we say in Amud Aleph? We said that you have to be mechashiv. You could estimate how much seed there is, and based off of that estimation, you could give the Levi. Says the Gemara, mechashiv? What does it mean you can estimate? Ha-medida bai. You have to measure it. You have to measure. Ha-man, he answers the Gemara, no, Abba Elazar ben Gimalu. There's the opinion of Abba Elazar ben Gimal that holds, even when it comes to Chumas Meiser, the 10% of the Levi, you're allowed to estimate. Meaning, by Chuma Gedailu, the first 2%, that's not an obligation. Midarais is a kol shu, whatever you want. So you wouldn't have to estimate. When it comes to giving the Levi his 10%, that we hold, the normal conventional opinion is it needs medida to measure to get the 10% proper. But Abba Elazar ben Gimel holds, you can even do that in estimation. The Tanya, as you learn from the Beitzah 4 lines from the top, Abba Elazar ben Gimel Aimer v'nechshav l'chad trumaschem. It says in the Torah that your truma should be counted for you. V'shtei trumas like Kasav Daber. What's trumaschem in the plural? So two different trumas. Achas truma gedayla. Both of them could be done in estimation. He tells an estimation and with thought. Therefore says the Gemara, that's not a problem. Gufa and the text of that which we just said a moment ago. Now this is going back to the second case, the case of Talmud Ahmed, when the Levi jumps the gun and takes in the ears of grain before it's fully finished, before the Kohen takes his 2%. Meiser, and I keep on saying 2%, but the right says kol shu, but the normal Beinoni gives 2%. Says the Gemara. 50th, Meiser reaches Shektima b'Shibailen Shemoy Toivloi l'Chumas Meiser. Its name is Tevel for Chumas Meiser. Says the Gemara, my time, but what's the reason? Amarava oil v'yatzlav Shem Meiser. Once it has the Shem Meiser, then it's going to have the din of Chumas Meiser. You're going to have to give it to the Levi. Says the Gemara, let's go a bit further. It's these two dots are a little bit interesting placed. It's the exact same case. Amar Rish Lakish. Meiser reached Shektima b'Shibailen, the din of Rav Avua. You don't give Chuma Gedayla. Rish Lakish says, not like we just said a moment ago. And if we said if the Levi comes early, takes his 10%, then the Kohen takes after, the Kohen effectively loses out a fifth. Says Rish Lakish, if the Levi comes and takes his 10%, b'shibailen while steering the ear of grain, before you have a proper pile, the halacha is it's pater from Chuma Gedayla, the Kohen loses out. Shenemar, how do I know that? Says Rish Lakish, Vari Meiser mimenu Chumas Hashem, and you should separate from him Chumas Hashem, Meiser mina Meiser. The pasuk concludes, take a Meiser from a Meiser. And from here we explain, says the Gemara, Meiser mina Meiser amarti l'cha. You take a Meiser from a Meiser. V'loi Chuma Gedayla, Chumas Meiser mina Meiser. Or you do not take Chuma Gedayla from Meiser. So if the Levi already got his Meiser, got his 10%, the Kohen will not get his 2% afterwards, then effectively the kohen's going to lose out. From the basic of the pasuk Hashem, that you only get meiser from meiser, not meiser from truma, or truma from meiser. Amalei Rav Papa Abaye 1 second. What you're saying is correct. Why was the whole case that the Levi jumped the gun? When did the Levi jump the gun? When the grains are still in the ears, before they're fully ground, before you have the pile. Ask Rav Papa 1 second. If you just learned me a pasuk that told me you do not think of meiser truma from meiser, so even if the pile is finished and you have a nice proper pile, if the Levi goes and jumps early, the kohen shouldn't get it afterwards. Amar lei. So he responds, Alecha Amar, because another pasuk. You gotta always think of truma. How do you know one is included and one is not? Because one is called grain and not, and therefore once it's called grain, once it's in a proper pile. Even if the Levi jumps the gun, the Levi does not gain, and the Levi will gain a bit, but he's still going to have to give the kohen subsequently. Says the Gemara, once we're on the topic of Meiser, let's equate and bring Meiser home to the halachas of Shabbos. Tanan also, we're at the 2 dots, about 20 lines down. First one in line is Itzgan. Tanan also, we learned to the Mishnah, Mekalif, so Irim Miklaf, Achas. Someone who peels barley, you let it peel them one at a time, and you can eat them. But if you peeled a lot, and you put it in your hands, at that moment, Chayiv, there's an obligation to take off Meiser, it's a large quantity. Amar Rav Elazar v'chein l'Shabbos. The same halachas for Shabbos. You let it peel one at a time and eat it, but once you peel a large quantity, then it's going to be forbidden on Shabbos. Asks the Gemara, Eini, is what you're saying correct? Asks the Gemara, we've two tremendous gedolim, Rav and Rav Chia, that their daughters, their wives, they peeled full cup worths of barley. So you're telling me you only got to do a little bit at a time, but they did a full cup worth. Seif Itmar says the Gemara, you're right. Let's switch it up. What did the Sefer that Beitzah say? This goes back to the first part of today's daf. Someone who's rolling ears of wheat. What's the halacha after you roll it and get off the husk? You could fan from hand to hand and eat it. But if you fan and you put it into your lap, you do a large quantity, then there's an obligation to take off meiser. And on this halacha, the halacha that you're allowed to do a little bit at a time and fan away the husks, and not put it all in your lap and fan away the husks. On this, Amar Rav Elazar v'chein l'Shabbos will be the same gedarim, the same quantifications with regard to Shabbos, that you'll be allowed to do a little bit of hand to hand and not do a large quantity that goes and sits on your lap. Says the Gemara, Maskiv Allah Rav Abraham Mamel. Ask Rav Abraham Mamel, you just taught me a din that you only let it peel in small quantities, and then there would be no obligation to take off meiser. For Rachel and meiser in the Shabbos light, the first part of the Beitzah, what did it say? It said that with regard to meiser, it's no problem. You can do a little bit at a time. But with regard to Shabbos, then it's a problem. And then that we asked, that we saw these great Gedolim that did even large quantities for Shabbos. Ask the Gemara 1 second, what was the whole premise? It's a very funny thing. If it's a Gemar Malacha, if it's a complete entity, that should be the both for Shabbos and for Meiser. Why are we differentiating? It should be the same halacha. That just whenever with regard to Meiser, you think of Meiser because it's completed. So too for Shabbos, you should be obligated. Why would we split up the two? So Maskiv Lo Rav Shishis Breder Rav. Idi as Rav Shishis the son of Rav Idi V'loi. Really? Is it not accurate? When it comes to Meiser to Goyren, when it's in the fully complete pile, that's not if it's learned in the Mishnah. The Gishum and the Diluyin, the gourds and the cucumbers, the pumpkins, when are they obligated to Meiser? Misha Yafsiku, which comes at the point that the blossoms fall off. And when the blossoms did not fall off, when you make a heap in a pile, so when you pile it up, then it has the obligation of Meiser. Similarly by onions, when you make it into a pile. Yet, if you look at Shabbos, so what was your whole question? That Shabbos and Meiser should have the same rules, same guidelines. Says the Gemara, what are you talking about? No way! We see very clearly that what's Meiser dependent upon? Making it into a pile. On Shabbos, is there anything wrong with making a pile? No, so we see that they're not the same. Says the Gemara, so what are you going to answer me? Meleches machsheves also ratayro, such an important rule we spoke about extensively in Gemara and Shabbos. That when it comes to Shabbos, it's not the pure actions that your hands do. It's meleches machsheves. It's a production action. It's a calculated action. That's what's forbidden. So too is going to be the same halacha over here, and that is how the Gemara differentiates between the two. That was the original comparison between the Meiser and between the Shabbos. We'll pick up from Ketzad and Mir Hashem tomorrow.